Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. There have been hundreds of Disney games over the years, which is no surprise as most of their characters can be recognised by people of all ages all across the world. Of course, Mickey is probably their biggest and most well-known character, even though it should be Jessica Rabbit. And as a result, he's had dozens of video games with his big ears in them. And surprisingly, most of them are actually quite good. Especially the hugely popular Illusion series, which started out on the Mega Drive or Genesis, and this is still regarded as one of the best games on the platform. Surprisingly though, the handful of sequels it got don't really get talked about anywhere near as much. Now, is that because they're rubbish, or did they just get lost in the vast number of other games that are out there? Well, how about I shut up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look for ourselves. We should probably start at the beginning with Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse for the Sega Mega Drive. What's interesting is that this game was actually made by Sega themselves, whereas a lot of people usually associate 16-bit Disney games with Capcom or Virgin. It also explains why it was only released on Sega platforms. Anyway, this is a side-scrolling platform game with the classic 16-bit story. Mickey's girlfriend Minnie has been kidnapped by the evil witch Miserabelle, who wants to steal Minnie's youth and beauty, which is understandable. The haggard old cowbag has a hold up in the Castle of Illusion, which is filled with doorways to fantastical worlds, each of which contains a rainbow gem that you need to get in order to open the door to Miserabelle's lair deeper in the castle. Of course, each gem is guarded by a boss, so you'll need to do some butt kicking, or rather butt stomping, in order to get them back. There's 5 worlds in total that are all quite different, and you need to explore an enchanted forest, a toy world, another forest or cave-like level that's plagued with floods and swimming areas, a sweet world, a library, and finally the castle proper. Each course is filled with enemies and hazards, mainly in the form of bottomless pits. What's cool is that something that I really appreciate in these games is that every world has its own enemies, with only a few being reused. This makes seeing each one great fun, as you do want to see what you'll be squishing with your ass next. In the forest there's evil trees, bugs, mushrooms and plants, and even ghosts. Then you get nutcrackers, toy planes and clowns in the toy level, worms and evil sugar cubes in the library, and so on. All the enemies suit their worlds, and of course the bosses at the end of each world are large creatures with patterns for you to discover and work out. The boss fights, though, they are the highlight. As I've alluded to, Mickey can butt drop enemies to defeat them. This is pretty effective and easy to use, though you do have to jump and then press jump again while you're in the air, but you soon get used to it. You can also collect projectiles on each world, which can be thrown to defeat most enemies. I usually forget that I actually have these and never really use them, though I really should have, as they kill most enemies in just one hit, but you do get a limited supply. When you're using Mickey's butt drop, you can bounce really high, which is often used to reach hidden ledges that contain health or diamonds for points, or of course sometimes an extra life. What's also cool here is that the levels have a nice little touch in them that makes them different, rather than just being standard levels where you go from left to right. Sometimes you're being chased by giant rolling apples, or avoiding floodwaters, or in one of the most impressive things for such an early game are the rooms that flip upside down when you hit a switch. It's really cool and does go a long way in giving the game its trademark charm. It's not a very tough game though, and you'll quite likely beat it after just a few tries. I actually got to the very last level on my first go, but as you all know I am basically a pro gamer, so that's not too surprising. There aren't that many levels, and it can actually be beaten in about an hour or so with just a little bit of practice. But it is always fun to play through, and one of those games that you can just put on when you want to relax with something familiar. Graphically, the game is good, but you can see it's an early game. The characters and levels do all look decent, but there are some generally impressive touches in here as well, like turning off lights when you swing on lamp cords, and of course the flipping rooms that looks pretty cool. My only real complaint is that the animation isn't fantastic. It's fine, but you just know that if this was released a year or two later, it would have been smooth as butter, rather than the slightly jerky animations that only have a few frames. Thankfully, it still does control very well, and it's incredibly responsive, making it loads of fun to actually play. This game was so popular that it even got ported to the Sega Saturn as part of a Mickey and Donald double pack, which I actually realised I do own, but I haven't played it yet. but from what I understand it's a perfect port, and it's even included as part of Sega's Mega Drive Mini, which is kind of surprising as it's a licensed game, and just goes to show how important the game is for the system. If you haven't played this yet, I highly recommend it. Castle of Illusion also got a version for the Sega Master System in the same year. The story is the same here, with Minnie being taken away by Miserabel and you having to get her back. But other than this, the game itself is actually quite a lot different, but it's still a great game. And you know what, I actually think that this is the better version of the game, being better than the Mega Drive or Genesis version, but that doesn't mean that you have to agree with me, of course. For the most part, the themes of the levels here are the same, exploring a forest, a toy world, sweet world, stationary world, and so on. The enemies are largely the same but have a different look and different attack patterns, and there are, however, a load of unique enemies in the game as well. And the levels themselves, while sharing aspects and themes from the Mega Drive version, are totally different. A lot of this is to help accommodate the game's new mechanics, which are very unique to this version. Mickey can still do his butt drop, and I actually think it works better here and has slightly better hit detection to it. Around the levels there's also chests and blocks that weren't in the Mega Drive version. You can butt drop on these to destroy them, and you can get cakes or coins or extra lives out of them. As well as this, you can actually pick up items, like the blocks and the chests, to throw them to either defeat enemies or sometimes to make platforms that you can use to reach new or hidden areas. This is a really cool mechanic that actually worked into the levels themselves and is good fun to use. Also, some of the levels have things like keys in them, and you'll need to get the keys and carry them to the door, kind of like Mario 2. You can throw the keys at enemies to defeat them, which is nice, and when you find the door, just chuck the key at it and it opens, just like in real life. There's no standard projectiles here like the ones you collect in the Mega Drive version, and I actually prefer how it all works here. Obviously, being on the Master System and having half the power, all of the fancy effects from the Mega Drive version have been taken out, but you do still get big boss fights. These are similar and are once again great fun to do. Working out the best way to kill the bosses can take a couple of tries, but once you get it down, they can be a complete cakewalk. There's also loads of secret chests hidden around the levels as well. To find these, you basically just have to butt drop everywhere, and if you do it in the right spot, a chest will just appear in thin air. These often contain health or coins that will give you points, and eventually an extra life. It's amazing how many of these I remember the locations of from when I had this growing up. Yeah, that's right, this is one of those games that I've owned for more than 20 years, and I'm still not bored of playing it. Graphically, the game is amazing for the Master System, and could almost be seen as a very early 16-bit game, but not quite. Mickey does look great, and more like his classic design, and I dare even say he looks and animates better than he does in the Mega Drive version. Everything here is just so bright and colourful. Once again, the controls are spot on, being smooth and responsive, but bouncing has never been easier. The game is still pretty short, and you'll be able to beat it fairly easily after a few tries, but you'll want to come back and do it again and again. This is a must-own game for the Master System, and I'd say it's easily one of the best for the system. Even if you have the Mega Drive version, you should definitely pick this one up, as the levels are pretty damn different, and it could almost be seen as a different game. But yeah, it's still worth owning. Being as it's basically a mini Master System, Castle of Illusion also came out for the Game Gear. It's pretty much a straight port of the Master System game, though some of the sprites have been dumbed down a little, like the chests and some of the enemies, and Mickey's sprite is also a little less detailed and a bit more jagged, but it's not something you'll notice on the small screen, which I do know because I do actually own this game for real on the actual Game Gear, and it's still a go-to when I want some Game Gear action. As well as this, some of the levels have had slight changes to the layout, but nothing too major, and it doesn't make any of it less fun. But other than that, this is basically the same game, and it's still a fantastic experience that, yep, I recommend picking up if you can, or playing any way possible. The very next year, Castle of Illusion got a follow-up, World of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse, and this time he's brought along Donald Duck with him as a second playable character. The story here is that Mickey and Donald are preparing for a magic show for their friends, and they find a mysterious magic box. They open the box, which is never a good idea, kids, and it turns out to belong to the evil magician Pete, and Mickey and Donald are sucked into a magical world and have to work together to escape. Unless you're playing single player like me, in which case you just choose which one of the characters you want to play as and they escape on their own, presumably leaving the other one to rot. So you set off through 5 worlds. Each has a similar theme to the original game, but not the same. You've got forests, caves, underwater caverns, haunted libraries, and the magic box itself that you need to get through, each ending with a boss that you need to defeat. There's no butt drop here though. In fact, you can't jump on enemies at all, which actually caused me all sorts of problems, as it really is a game that feels like you should be able to do that. Instead, you wave your magic cape over bad guys in order to turn them into harmless things like doves or butterflies. Some enemies take a few hits, others just the one, and of course bosses take a lot more. The cape works well enough when you're used to it, though the range is a little odd, and I was never really sure how far from an enemy I had to be, though I didn't find I'd take unfair damage because of it. I did, however, die a few times unfairly thanks to parts of the levels that are basically trial and error, and one section where you're falling for some rocks from the sky and there's a specific spot that you need to land, but there's no way to know this until you've seen it once and you know where to land. To be fair, this doesn't really happen that often and you'll learn after 1 or 2 tries, but it does feel like a bit of a cheap way to kill you. Though, to be fair, you get plenty of lives and it isn't a terribly hard game overall. As you progress, you'll learn new spells, which really are just a segue into getting you onto the next level, like learning how to use a magic carpet so you can fly to the next world on it, and also a spell that lets you breathe underwater, which is convenient as the very next world is almost entirely underwater. This level was actually a pain in the ass, and it's really hard to avoid the spikes and enemies that are in the water. The hit detection isn't great here, and the controls could do with a bit of tightening up. What I do like though is that the game has obvious nods to other Disney properties, with characters and locations being familiar from other films, like playing card soldiers from Alice in Wonderland and the Caterpillar guy as well. It's a really nice touch. Also, the game is slightly different depending on which character you play as, though I do think this only applies in single player and not the 2-player co-op. Mickey is smaller than Donald and can fit through smaller gaps. This means the 2 characters usually take a different route through levels at certain points, which is really cool. Sadly, other than that, they're basically a palette swap with just the same attacks, jumps and overall control, but it is nice to have the option of who you want to play as. Graphically, the game is great. All the levels have a ton of detail and sometimes stuff going on in the background, and all the character sprites are really well done, and I love Donald being the grumpy duck he is. He's basically my spirit animal. The animation here is also very good, though I do find that everything here just feels a little bit too slow, and it makes it look a bit jerky, and it can actually make the platforming slightly awkward at times. I thought the Mega Drive was meant to have blast processing. If everything was sped up just by a half, it would have made the whole game feel loads better to play if you ask me. But that's not to say it's not fun to play. In fact, it is pretty good fun, and though it's really not as fun as the first game, I still would recommend giving it a playthrough. In 1993, we got Land of Illusion for the Sega Master System. For some reason, there was never a Mega Drive version of this, despite the popularity of the other 2 games. In this one, we see Mickey fall asleep while reading a book of fairy tales. He wakes up to see Daisy Duck dressed as Red Riding Hood, asking for some help, as some bastard phantom has stolen the magic crystal from the town. Oh, and of course he took the princess for good measure. So you've got to set off to find the princess, who can also tell you how to get to the phantom and get the crystal back. The gameplay here is more like the first game, but fleshed out a little bit more. It's a platform game of course, and Mickey can do his legendary butt drop again, as well as being able to pick up and throw objects at enemies to defeat them. The game has a total of 14 stages you can visit, and this time you unlock them on a map as you play, and you can go back and forth to any of the previous levels as often as you want. A lot of them you don't have to, but what's cool is that you get items in some levels after defeating the bosses, or sometimes you find them hidden somewhere. These items will then give you access to new stages or areas, sometimes letting you get into new routes in the earlier stages, so you'll need to do some backtracking on old levels to get to new parts of them to find a new item to progress. I like this. Though, don't be like me, actually watch the cutscenes here. Often when you beat a boss, it will turn out to be a character that's been transformed by the Phantom. Beat them and they'll turn back to normal, and they'll tell you what you need to do, where you need to go, and what items to use. I skipped a lot of these cutscenes, I won't lie, and I didn't realise, and I was spending ages trying to find a new level, whereas if I just read the damn thing, I would have known exactly where to go in just a couple of minutes. The levels themselves are all very different, and usually have their own quirks in them, like fire, water and so on. Some even have puzzle elements with switches and things needing to be pressed or blocks put in certain places. There's also a noticeably large amount of swimming in this game. These sections are quite annoying, and to make things worse, Mickey now has limited air supply, so you do have to work fast and don't forget to come up for air. Graphically, of course, the game is excellent. The Mickey sprite seems to be the same as the one from the other game, though has a few more animations in here. The levels are all large and detailed, and the enemies and bosses are all great. Some being reused from Castle of Illusion. The bosses once again though are large and really cool, and a lot harder than the first game, but fighting them and figuring out their patterns is still good fun. Overall, this is a fantastic follow-up, and I'm surprised it didn't get a port to some sort of Mega Drive. Either way, it's still well worth playing and owning on the Master System. It feels like a much larger adventure, and while I do still prefer Castle of Illusion, you certainly can't go wrong with this. And once again, as it's basically the same thing, Land of Illusion got a port to the Sega Game Gear, once again offering basically the same experience but for the handheld. Now, other than being on the smaller screen with slightly different graphics in a handful of cases, I didn't notice any difference between the actual game or the level design itself. It still looks great, the controls are just as good and responsive, apart from the bloody underwater bits, and the game works the same, with you exploring the levels via the map screen, finding items to reach new areas, and of course sticking your ass on anything and everything that you can. So yeah, this is another one worth getting if you can. Next up, we got Legend of Illusion, released in 1994 for the Master System and Game Gear. Again, the Mega Drive didn't get a version of any kind for some reason. The story here is that an evil force and dark shadow has invaded the peaceful land, and the only way to get rid of it is for a king to get some magic water and give it a splash. Pete, who is currently the king, is also a pussy, so makes Mickey, who's just a lowly clothes washer, the honorary king, thus giving him the magic powers needed to find the magic water. So Mickey reluctantly sets off across a bunch of levels tracking down the water so he can save the day. The gameplay here has changed a bit from the previous games in the title. You control Mickey over a ton of levels which you see on a map, but you have no choice as to where you go here. You just move from one to the next, which is fine. And for the most part, the levels are just a case of getting from left to right, and then fighting a boss at the end of every few of them. Mickey can still run, jump and pick things up to throw them at enemies, but criminally, his butt drop is gone. I've got no idea why they made this decision. Instead, Mickey throws rocks or other things at enemies to defeat them, which does work fine, but I would rather have had the butt drop. The arc of the throw just isn't very good, and hitting enemies could be tough, and I would often instinctively try to jump on enemies instead and take damage. As well as this, Mickey does have a few new abilities, like being able to swing and shimmy across ropes, and these moves do come in handy. The levels here also have more of an emphasis on puzzle solving, which is usually pressing switches or navigating mazes. Some of these can actually be pretty damn tricky, or just downright annoying, but it's never really anything too bad. One of the levels is even a scrolling shooter, which is a nice way to mix things up. There's also gems on the level that you can collect, and if you get every single one in the game, you're treated to a different ending. I did not get every single one. The levels themselves are pretty large and packed with things to collect, as well as some pretty annoying enemies. You'll definitely need to practice this one, and it's easily the hardest game in this series if you ask me. It does still look great though, with some awesome graphics across the board. All the characters and animations are really good for the Master System, and the large levels are detailed, though it would have been nice to have a bit more going on in the background. I suppose this is common for the Master System though. Once again, the bosses are a highlight, being pretty damn tough a lot of the time, and while some can be cheap, like the first boss, which is just a shadow ghost that appears in random places on the screen, and you've got no way of knowing where it's going to appear, which means you die a lot against him. The others though were all manageable, and I did enjoy fighting them. Something I really don't like though is the way the screen scrolls in some levels. Usually left to right is fine, But in some, but not all levels, when you reach the top of the screen, everything stops so it can scroll, rather than just scrolling smoothly like all the other ones do. I would love to know why they did this. It does get really annoying when you're on a stage and you have to be close to the top of the screen, and then every time you jump, the game has to pause to scroll for a second, then pauses again when you're coming down and landing. It's just frustrating. But that doesn't make it unplayable or anything, and this certainly isn't a bad game. I would say it is the worst one of the lot, though it is still worth a playthrough if you enjoy the other games in this series, which I assume everyone does. Now, this one did actually come out on the Game Gear as well, but I could only find a totally legit copy for the Master System. Even the totally legit copies that I got that said they were for the Game Gear turned out to be Master System versions. But my guess is that it will basically be the same game, just like the other two were, so if you do only have a Game Gear, I reckon it's still worth a look, but only if you already have the other two, as I would say they're much better. And finally for today, here is Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, a new imagining of the classic game that incorporates aspects from both the Mega Drive and Master System version in full 2.5D glory, released as a digital exclusive for the PS3 and Xbox 360. This is the PS3 version. Now, often these remakes are a recipe for disaster, but is that the case here? In short, no. This actually is exactly how you should remake a game, if you ask me. The story and aim of the game is of course the same. Miserable has nabbed Minnie and wants to use her to make herself sexy and young, so Mickey goes to the Castle of Illusion to stop the bitch. The developers, Sega Studios Australia, did a fantastic job of paying homage to the original game while adding new modern aspects to the game. The titular castle is now a proper hub world, and you can explore it as a 3D environment. There are loads of rooms all over the place which need to be opened by collecting a certain number of gems and crystals, kind of like Mario 64 or other 3D platforms of that era. Though, to be honest, this is kind of pointless, as it basically just works out that by the time you complete a level, you have already what you need to get to the next one, and you can't actually do any of the levels outside of a certain order. But still, it's good fun. Each of the worlds from the original game are represented here, and they all look incredible. They're split into 3 different levels each, with the third level being the boss fight. It's really great to see how they've taken the levels from the original game and given them a new spin, while keeping them completely recognisable. All of the worlds have these same elements, like ghosts you bounce on in the forest, the rotating room in the toy world, and the underwater currents in the cave flood level. But the levels themselves are much larger and have a lot more going on in them. There's many more things to collect, including hidden cards, pictures, and Donald's fiery chilies that he somehow managed to lose. These are often hidden in very hard to reach places that require you to bounce on a lot of enemies or navigate crumbling platforms, but it's cool to have these things that you need to go and backtrack for to go back to previously beaten levels. If you collect all these things, you get new outfits for Mickey to wear. Personally though, I thought it would have been better if you got to actually play as Donald or Mickey, but hey, that might be a licensing thing. The levels here all tend to have a 3D section in them at some point, where you don't just move left to right. These often have tricky platforming, or are sections where you're running away from something towards the screen, like an homage to Mickey's Wild Adventure on the 16-bit consoles and PS1. The enemies here are all recognisable from the original game, but usually have a few new surprises to keep you on your toes. The bosses in particular are all straight from the original, but have brand new attack patterns and are really fun to fight. To defeat enemies, you can just jump on them. No need for the butt stomp here. Just jump and land on them and you're done. And to be honest, I do kind of prefer this, as it's easier and it's all it needs. You do also have your projectiles you can throw as well. These are also used for other things though, like breaking blocks to open pathways or opening chests, so don't go too crazy with them as supplies are limited. Graphically, as you can see, the game looks fantastic. Mickey has his classic design and all the enemies look straight out of the cartoons, and everything just has fantastic animation, including the levels themselves, which have so much stuff going on at all times that you can often be distracted by what's going on in the background. And what's cool is that you often have things like being able to see the boss at some point in an earlier level and then coming across them later and realising you have to fight them. There's just so many little touches and details that really make it fun to play. I did find, however, that there were times where the game slowed down quite often, when there was just a few enemies around and stuff going on all over the screen, especially with reflections. but it was never enough to ruin the fun. The controls are spot on. You can use the analog stick or the D-pad, and I found that I just used the D-pad for the whole thing, though I guess I would sometimes switch to the analog stick for the 3D sections. The collision detection is good, but wasn't always in my favour, it didn't seem, and I do think there were times where I took damage but really shouldn't have, especially against flying enemies and bosses. Something else worth a mention, which is actually something I should have mentioned for all of the Castle of Illusion versions, is that the music is incredible and will be stuck in your head for days, no matter if it's this one, the Sega Mega Drive one, or the Master System. Also, this remake has a really cool narrator that explains what's going on throughout the levels. I really like this touch, and it makes it feel like you're playing through a proper storybook, and I could be wrong, but it sounds just like the bloke that did the voice for the 500 Days of Summer voiceover. Overall, this really is a fantastic remake that does pretty much everything right, apart from the fact that it was only ever released digitally, so it's no longer available on consoles. So unless you already own it, you have to get the PC version, or, hack your PS3 or Xbox 360 so you can download it. This is one of the reasons I'm not a fan of the whole digital only thing. Sadly, the studio that made this game closed after making it, which really is a shame, as they did a fantastic job, and I hope they know what a good job they did. If you can play this one, then you really should. It's an awesome nostalgia hit, and just a fantastic game in its own right. So there you go. That's every game in Mickey's Awesome Illusion series. Which one is your favourite? Let me know in the comments below. And there's a ton of games where Mickey is the star, so maybe I'll make a video about some of the other ones somewhere down the line. But for now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.